6 months before the first strike of Operation Epic Fury, every Iranian warship in the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea was already being tracked. Not approximately tracked, not monitored when satellites happened to pass overhead. Continuously tracked. Every vessel, every movement, every time a fast attack boat left its pier and returned. Every time the Shahid Bagheri shifted position. Every time an Iranian submarine departed Bandar Abbas, and every time it came back. United States Space Command, working in coordination with the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and Allied intelligence services, had built a targeting picture of the Iranian naval order of battle that was, by the time Epic Fury began, essentially complete. The locations of every significant Iranian naval asset were known. Their operating patterns were understood. Their maintenance cycles had been observed long enough to predict when specific vessels would be at pier and when they would be at sea. This is the intelligence foundation that made time on target possible. You cannot strike 47 targets simultaneously unless you know where all 47 targets are. And you cannot know where all 47 targets are unless you have been watching them continuously for long enough to understand their patterns and predict their locations on any given day. Space Command built that picture, and it built it months before anyone outside a small circle of planners knew that Epic Fury was coming. To understand what Space Command actually contributed to Epic Fury, you need to understand what the organization does and why it exists as a separate command. United States Space Command was re-established as an independent combatant command in 2019, recognizing that space had become a war-fighting domain rather than simply a support environment. The command is responsible for conducting space operations, providing space capabilities to other combatant commands, and defending American space assets from adversary interference. For Epic Fury, the relevant Space Command capabilities fell into 3 broad categories: surveillance and reconnaissance, navigation and targeting support, and communications relay. The surveillance and reconnaissance mission is the most relevant for understanding how Iranian naval movements were tracked. The American military operates a constellation of imagery intelligence satellites, signals intelligence satellites, and space-based radar systems that provide coverage of the Earth's surface at intervals and resolutions that are largely classified but that are understood to be extraordinary by historical standards. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is approximately 330 meters long and has a flight deck that is nearly 80 meters wide. It is one of the largest objects on Earth. From orbit, it is easily visible and easily identifiable. But the Iranian fast attack boats that represented the primary swarming threat are far smaller, 20 to 30 meters long, radar cross-sections orders of magnitude smaller than a carrier, capable of hiding in harbors and coastal inlets where visual identification from orbit is more difficult. Tracking those small vessels continuously required combining multiple intelligence streams. Imagery satellites provided periodic high-resolution snapshots. Signals intelligence satellites collected electronic emissions from Iranian naval communications and radar systems. Space-based synthetic aperture radar provided coverage in conditions where optical imagery was degraded by clouds or darkness. Maritime patrol aircraft and submarines provided additional persistent coverage at lower altitudes and closer ranges. The fusion of these streams, coordinated through the intelligence architecture that Space Command helps manage, produced the comprehensive Iranian naval picture that made the opening strikes of Epic Fury possible. The 6-month timeline of pre-conflict surveillance is significant for reasons that go beyond the specific achievements of Epic Fury. 6 months before the conflict, there was no public indication that military action against Iran was imminent. Diplomatic activity was ongoing. The normal pattern of American carrier deployments to the region, which had been continuous for decades, did not immediately signal to outside observers that something different was being planned. But inside Space Command and the intelligence agencies it works with, the surveillance intensification that preceded Epic Fury was already underway. Satellite collection priorities were being shifted toward Iranian naval targets. The baseline pattern of life data, the routine movements and behaviors of Iranian naval vessels under normal conditions, was being accumulated so that deviations from normal patterns could be detected and analyzed. This baseline accumulation is essential for the kind of targeting that Epic Fury required. You cannot build a time-on-target strike package for 47 vessels if you do not know where those vessels typically are, when they are typically at pier versus at sea, what their maintenance cycles look like, and what indicators precede their departure from port. 6 months of continuous surveillance gave American planners exactly this knowledge. By the time the operational planning for Epic Fury reached its final phase, the targeting package was not being built from scratch. It was being refined from a foundation of intelligence that had been accumulating for half a year. This timeline has a specific implication that is worth stating clearly. The decision to begin intensive surveillance of Iranian naval assets preceded the political decision to execute military operations by months. The intelligence community was building the foundation for a potential military operation before that operation was authorized. This is standard practice for contingency planning, but it means that the targeting capability that enabled Epic Fury was developed through a long, patient, unglamorous process of satellite passes and data accumulation that had nothing dramatic about it, and that will never receive the recognition that the strikes themselves received. The satellites did not fire weapons. They watched. For 6 months, they watched. And everything they saw became the foundation for what happened on February 28th. The specific role of commercial satellite imagery in the Epic Fury intelligence picture deserves attention because it represents a genuinely new development in how wars are prepared and fought. In previous conflicts, the imagery intelligence picture of adversary military assets was held exclusively by government agencies with access to classified satellite systems. The public saw what governments chose to show them. Independent verification of military claims was essentially impossible without access to classified systems. Epic Fury was different. Commercial satellite imagery companies, including Maxar Technologies, Planet Labs, and others, had been collecting imagery of Iranian military facilities for years and making it available to subscribers, including news organizations, research institutions, and individual analysts. The resolution of commercial satellite imagery had improved dramatically over the preceding decade, reaching the point where commercial systems could identify individual vessels, assess base activity, and detect construction and modification work at military facilities. This commercial imagery layer served multiple functions for Epic Fury. For American military planners, commercial imagery provided an additional data stream that could be used to cross-check and validate intelligence from classified systems. For the public and for allied governments, commercial imagery provided independent confirmation of battle damage assessments after strikes occurred, making it significantly harder for Iran to dispute CENTCOM's claims about what had been destroyed. The release of commercial satellite imagery showing the destroyed state of Bandar Abbas and other Iranian naval facilities in the days after the opening strikes was not simply a media curiosity. It was a deliberate part of the information environment management around the conflict, designed to establish an independent factual baseline that Iranian information operations could not effectively contest. Space Command does not control commercial satellite companies. But the existence of the commercial imagery layer, which Space Command planners had incorporated into their understanding of the information environment, significantly shaped the information dynamics of the conflict. The navigation and targeting support mission of Space Command during Epic Fury was the most direct operational contribution of space capabilities to the strikes themselves. Every precision-guided munition used in Epic Fury that relied on GPS guidance was dependent on the constellation of GPS satellites managed and protected by Space Command. The JDAM kits that convert unguided bombs into precision weapons use GPS receivers to navigate to their targets. The Tomahawk cruise missiles that flew hundreds of miles to hit specific aim points in Iran used GPS for terminal navigation. The LRASM anti-ship missiles that hunted Iranian naval vessels used GPS as part of their multi-mode guidance systems. GPS is so fundamental to modern American military operations that it is often treated as a given, an infrastructure layer that simply exists and functions reliably. But GPS is a space-based system that can be jammed, spoofed, or degraded by adversary action. Iran had invested in GPS jamming capabilities specifically because disrupting American precision guidance was a potential asymmetric countermeasure against the kind of strike campaign that Epic Fury represented. Space Command's role included counter-jamming operations designed to maintain GPS signal integrity in the operating area, coordination with the GPS constellation managers to ensure maximum signal availability, and monitoring of Iranian jamming attempts to enable tactical adjustments in weapon delivery parameters. The Tomahawk missiles that hit their targets in Iran did so partly because Space Command kept the GPS signals they relied on available and accurate. The communications relay function of Space Command during Epic Fury was the invisible connective tissue that held the entire operation together. Modern joint military operations require continuous, high-bandwidth, low-latency communications between forces operating across thousands of miles. The carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea and Mediterranean needed to communicate with each other, with land-based headquarters, with the submarines operating at depth, with the B-2 bombers flying from Missouri, with the targeting cells in Qatar and Bahrain, with Five Eyes intelligence partners sharing real-time data on Iranian movements. Most of this communication travels through military satellite communication systems that Space Command helps manage and protect. The bandwidth required to sustain the operational tempo of Epic Fury, the constant flow of targeting data, battle damage assessment imagery, operational orders, intelligence updates, and command communications, is enormous. Iran understood that disrupting American communications would degrade the coordination that made time on target possible. Iranian cyber and electronic warfare capabilities included attempts to interfere with American satellite communications. Space Command's defensive mission included protecting the satellite links that American forces depended on against exactly these attempts. The communications worked throughout Epic Fury. The targeting data flowed, the orders arrived, the battle damage assessments were transmitted. Every strike was coordinated with every other strike across thousands of miles of ocean and land. This did not happen automatically. It happened because Space Command protected the infrastructure that made it possible. 6 months of watching, gigabytes of imagery, thousands of satellite passes, signals collected and analyzed, patterns identified, targeting packages built. And then, when the moment came, the GPS signals were clear, the communications were secure, and every Iranian naval commander who woke up on February 28th to find their bases under attack was dealing with the product of 6 months of work they never knew was happening. Space Command did not fire a single weapon during Operation Epic Fury. It made every weapon that was fired possible. There is a final dimension of Space Command's Epic Fury contribution that has received almost no public attention: the China dimension. Everything Space Command did against Iran, the continuous surveillance, the targeting picture development, the GPS support, the communications protection, it is doing against China right now. This is not speculation. It is the logical implication of Space Command's mission and the strategic priority that China represents for American defense planning. The surveillance infrastructure that watched Iranian naval assets for 6 months before Epic Fury is not unique to Iran. It is a global system. And the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy, which is significantly larger and more capable than Iran's, is being watched with at least the same intensity. Chinese military planners understand this. They have invested heavily in anti-satellite capabilities specifically because they understand that American space-based intelligence and communication systems are fundamental to the kind of precision targeting that Epic Fury demonstrated. China's direct ascent anti-satellite missiles, its co-orbital interference satellites, its ground-based laser systems capable of blinding imagery satellites. All of these capabilities are designed to degrade the Space Command infrastructure that Epic Fury relied on. The question for any future Pacific conflict is not whether Space Command will try to replicate what it did for Epic Fury. It will. The question is whether it can succeed against an adversary that has spent 15 years specifically building capabilities designed to prevent that success. Iran had no meaningful anti-satellite capability. China has a serious one. The satellites that watched Iran's Navy for 6 months are still watching. They are watching ports and bases from the South China Sea to the Western Pacific. They are accumulating the pattern of life data that would be needed to build targeting packages for a different and much harder conflict. Whether those satellites will still be functioning when that conflict begins is the question that keeps Space Command planners awake at night. For now, they watch. The data accumulates. The targeting picture deepens, just as it did for 6 months before February 28, 2026. The specific intelligence architecture that produced the pre-conflict Iranian naval picture deserves a more detailed examination because it reveals how fundamentally the relationship between intelligence and military operations has changed in the past 2 decades. In previous generations, targeting a naval force required either human intelligence sources inside the adversary's military, signals intelligence collection that could be connected to specific vessel movements, or reconnaissance aircraft that were detectable and that provided only periodic snapshots of a dynamic situation. The architecture that Space Command helped coordinate for Epic Fury was categorically different. It combined multiple persistent surveillance systems that collectively provided something approaching continuous coverage of the Iranian naval order of battle across all operating areas. The National Reconnaissance Office's imagery satellite constellation passed over Iranian naval facilities multiple times per day. Between passes, synthetic aperture radar satellites provided coverage regardless of cloud cover or darkness. Signals intelligence satellites collected the electronic emissions from Iranian naval communications, radar systems, and command networks. Space-based infrared systems detected heat signatures from vessel engines, providing additional data on which vessels were operating and which were at rest. Below the space layer, maritime patrol aircraft flying out of land bases in the Gulf region provided persistent acoustic and radar coverage of the water surface and subsurface. The P-8A aircraft that would later hunt Iranian submarines during the conflict were, in the months before, building the baseline acoustic picture of Iranian submarine operating patterns. American attack submarines operating quietly contributed their own acoustic and signals intelligence to the picture. The fusion of these streams into the coherent targeting picture that enabled Epic Fury was the intelligence achievement that made the military achievement possible. It did not happen automatically. It required processing systems capable of integrating terabytes of data from different collection systems, analysts capable of interpreting what the data showed, and operational planners capable of translating the intelligence picture into targeting packages. Space Command sits at the top of this architecture because space-based systems provide the foundation layer that everything else builds on. Without the satellite coverage, the other collection systems operate with less context and less certainty. With it, the picture that emerges is more complete and more actionable than anything previous generations of military planners had access to. The international dimension of the space-based intelligence picture for Epic Fury is significant and largely unacknowledged in public analysis. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand shares signals intelligence and other collection at a level of integration that no other multilateral relationship achieves. During Epic Fury, Five Eyes partners contributed collection from their own national technical means that supplemented American systems and filled gaps in coverage. The United Kingdom operates its own imagery and signals intelligence satellites and provides collection from locations and orbital parameters that complement American coverage. Australia's geographical position provides collection access to parts of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia that is complementary to collection from American orbital positions. New Zealand's Waihopai Signals Intelligence Station, operating as part of the Global Echelon Signals Intelligence Network, contributed collection that was integrated into the Epic Fury intelligence picture. This international intelligence architecture is not visible in the public narrative of Epic Fury. CENTCOM press releases describe American military actions. They do not describe the Allied intelligence collection that fed the targeting. The Allied contributions happen in the classified layers of the operation and emerge, if at all, in the background acknowledgments that Allies were thanked for their support. But the targeting picture that enabled Epic Fury was an alliance product, not just an American one. Every satellite pass, every signals collection, every processed image that contributed to knowing where 47 Iranian naval vessels were on February 28th was the product of a surveillance architecture that took decades to build and that multiple nations contributed to. Space Command coordinates the American portion of that architecture. The alliance coordination happens through liaison relationships and shared systems that exist because of 70 years of investment in multilateral intelligence sharing. The satellites watched, the analysts fused, the planners targeted, the aircraft struck. All of it, from the first satellite pass 6 months before the conflict to the last battle damage assessment image after the final strike, was the product of an intelligence architecture that most people never think about and that works precisely because it operates invisibly. That invisibility is its strength. And Space Command, which sits at the center of its space-based layer, is the most invisible part of the most invisible architecture in the American military.